Hello, happy Sunday. It's a cool fall, November 1st. We didn't finish the book for Victober. I'm sorry, Siddharth, I feel like we failed you, but at least we read something for Victober to celebrate. It is November now. We're into the season of thankfulness, and I'm thankful for you all. I'm thankful we made it to 2010. Apologize for my wet hair, but I have to go tutor because I am a best tutor friend. Hello, Siddharth. It was either have dry hair and don't read, or have wet head and read. So I'm hoping you guys appreciate my sacrifice. No, I'm just joking. I don't like to blow my hair dry. So we are in the middle of chapter 18 in my version. It is page 90. And they're trying to get to Irene. I'm glad you made it to a live. Thanks. I'm glad you're here. I didn't give you a very helpful time when I would be online. I'm sorry. I'm just not a predictable person. I get on when I can get on. And I had yesterday was Halloween with my granddaughter, and we had a great time. And by the way, this is to Haley. See, we do have the same version. This is a plug for our next book, although you can see we have a lot of book remaining here. But Animal Farm will be next, based on the poll that we took. So if you haven't subscribed already, I don't know if you can participate in the polls without subscribing. I just don't know how YouTube works. But this one is short. Hopefully we'll get through it quickly. I have not read this book. Thank you, Siddharth, for telling you that. I have not read this book since I was probably y'all's age or younger. And so we'll see what we think about it now that I'm a grown A woman. We'll see what we think of Animal Farm. Tushar Thok, hello everybody. I get fussed at when I talk too much. I need to read. So let's read. Middle of 90, or top quarter of 90. They're discussing, is Mr. Darcy the good guy, or is Wickham the right, who's telling the right story? And everybody's starting to take their sides. That, again, when I try and connect things to high school, that is the worst in high school, when there's some fallout in a group, whether it's sports group, the cheer squad, an honors class, what have you. Then you start deciding who you believe and who you don't believe. And I'm sorry, but I found out my dad tested negative for COVID, which is such a relief. And so all the family in the group chat is coming in saying, yay, we're glad to hear it. So Slime by Sarah, then Back to Lord of the Flies. That is a book that I have on my playlist. Not one of my favorite books either. They're all, to me, kind of in the same genre. I like this feel, look at human behavior more in a positive light. Although this is very critical. Austin is very critical of society, but this seems so fatalistic and everything's going to end badly. Siddharth, give me a report in Discord. There's my plug for Discord. I don't have a Jane Eyre, but you could put it in with Pride and Prejudice. I don't have a Victober channel either, I don't think. So either way, just if it's general comments or book reviews or books you liked or don't like, give me some feedback on how you like Jane Eyre. All right, so here we go. I don't know how to make you a moderator in Discord. Are you already a moderator, Siddharth? I'll talk to me about that over on Discord and I'll figure it out. Okay, well, let me know how to do that. Like, send me the message, DM me, or whatever you do there, and then we can make the channel. So, his guilt and his dissent appear by your account to be the same, said Elizabeth angrily, for I have heard you accuse him of nothing worse than being the son of Mr. Darcy Stewart, and of that, I read this last time, I can assure you he informed me himself. So she's already prejudiced toward Wickham. I beg your pardon, replied Miss Bingley, turning away with a sneer. Excuse my interference. It was kindly meant. Insolent girl, said Elizabeth to herself. You are much mistaken if you expect to influence me by such a paltry attack as this. I see nothing in it but your own wilful ignorance and the malice of Mr. Darcy. She then sought her eldest sister, who had undertaken to make inquiries on the same subject of Bingley. Jane met her with a smile of such sweet complacency, a glow of such happy expression, as sufficiently marked how well she was satisfied with the occurrences of the evening. Elizabeth instantly read her feelings, and at that moment solicitude for Wickham, resentment against his enemies, and everything else gave way before the hope of Jane's being in the fairest way for happiness. I want to know, she said, with a countenance no less smiling than her sister's, what you've learnt about Mr. Wickham. But perhaps you've been too pleasantly engaged to think of any third party, in which case you may be sure of my pardon. No, replied Jane, I have not forgotten him, but I have nothing satisfactory to tell you. Mr. Bingley does not know the whole of his history, and is quite ignorant of the circumstances which have principally offended Mr. Darcy, but he will vouch for the good conduct, the probity, and the honor, and I apologize, I already read this, but I'm just rereading it to keep me caught up. The probity and honor of his friend, and is perfectly convinced that Mr. Wickham has deserved much less attention from Mr. Darcy than he has received. And I'm sorry to say that by his account, as well as his sister's, Mr. Wickham is by no means a respectable young man. I'm afraid he's been very imprudent and has deserved to lose Mr. Darcy's regard. I believe that's where I finished. Mr. Bingley does not know Mr. Wickham himself? No, he never saw him till the other morning at Meryton. This account, then, is what he received from Mr. Darcy. I'm perfectly satisfied. But what does he say of the living? He does not exactly recollect the circumstances, though he has heard them from Mr. Darcy more than once, but he believes that it was left to him conditionally only. I have not a doubt of Mr. Bingley's sincerity, said Elizabeth warmly, but you must excuse my not being convinced by assurances only. Mr. Bingley's defense of his friend was a very able one, I dare say, but since he is unacquainted with the several parts of the story, and has learnt the rest from that friend himself, I shall venture still to think of both gentlemen as I did before. She then changed the discourse to one more gratifying to each, and on which there could be no difference of sentiment. Elizabeth listened with delight to the happy, though modest hopes which Jane entertained of Bingley's regard, and said all in her power to heighten her confidence in it. On their being joined by Mr. Bingley himself, Elizabeth withdrew to Miss Lucas, to whose inquiry after the pleasantness of her last partner she had scarcely replied, before Mr. Collins came up to them, and told her with great exultation that he had just been so fortunate as to make a most important discovery. I have found out, he said, by a singular... Sorry, I got distracted by Tushar's post. That's your Instagram name? Is that what you're telling me? So it's so nice to meet you. Can you do me a favor if that's who you are? So I'm going to ask the favor after you confirm that's who you are, then I know you're still here. I have found out, he said, by a singular accident, that there is now in the room a near relation of my patroness. I happened to overhear the gentleman himself mentioning to the young lady who does the honors of this house the names of his cousin, Miss de Bourgh, and of her mother, Lady Catherine. How wonderfully these sort of things occur! Who would have thought of my meeting with perhaps a nephew of Lady Catherine de Bourgh in this assembly? So he's all excited that he's connected, that Mr. Darcy is there, and Mr. Darcy is the relation of his patroness. Okay, so Rakmachinda, the favor is you had, I think it was, no, it wasn't you. I saw on Instagram someone put up a post about Asexual Appreciation Week or Understanding Week or whatever the weeks are. And it was the asexual spectrum. And I thought it was a really well laid out spectrum of the different definitions of asexuality and the understandings. My generation, that's really new to me. And I really wanted to go back and revisit it. And the time, it was on a story, so the time was done. So I wanted to ask you to share that with me, but it wasn't you. I realized after I thought about it, because I knew I had looked at your Instagram for another, because you put a story up about me and I didn't get to see that either. So I don't know I don't know if you were on Pride and Prejudice. I don't know what your story was about. I was driving or something when I saw it, so I didn't really look at it, and then it was gone too. Those things go so quickly. Nestor, hello. So back to reading. So now Mr. Collins, he loves to be in the inn with everybody. So he's so thrilled that Mr. Darcy is there. I am most thankful that the discovery is made in time for me to pay my respects to him, which I am now going to do. And trust he will excuse my not having done it before. My total ignorance of the connection must plead my apology. You are not going to introduce yourself to Mr. Darcy? Indeed, I am. I shall entreat his pardon for not having done it earlier. I believe him to be Lady Catherine's nephew. It will be in my power to assure him that her ladyship was quite well yesterday night. Yesterday, a week ago, I think is what that means. Reading Frankenstein now. Of mine? Good. I got fussed at because I think I skip around on Frankenstein. And I don't know if that's the book, because there's 2 books I know I skip around and a third that I never finished. And so sometimes I get fussed at in comments that I did that. So I apologize. I like Frankenstein a lot, but sometimes you lose the thread of the story and all this other detail. And when I'm teaching it, the audience that I was teaching to, the students that I was teaching to, were struggling enough with just the story, with all the extraneous fluff of the Turkish family. And I can't think of their name right now. So I kind of skip that part because it's not instrumental to the telling of the tale, although it is, yes, the frame stories. And there's so many frame stories that the class that I was teaching really was struggling with it. So I made a teacher's executive decision to skip and go to avoid detail that would just confuse them, that wouldn't really be relevant to the fundamental aspect of the story that they needed to focus on. So I apologize for that, but you're a strong reader. You'll read it on your own. Just pause. Don't go to the next chapter until you've read the parts that I skipped over. Elizabeth tried hard to dissuade him from such a scheme, assuring him that Mr. Darcy would consider his addressing him without introduction as an impertinent freedom, rather than a compliment to his aunt, that it was not in the least necessary there should be any notice on either side, and that if it were, it must belong to Mr. Darcy, the superior, in consequence, to begin the acquaintance. Mr. Collins listened to her with a determined air of following his own inclination, and when she ceased speaking, replied thus: "My dear Miss Elizabeth, I have the highest opinion in the world of your excellent judgment in all matters within the scope of your understanding. Mansplaining. But permit me to say that there must be a wide difference between the established forms of ceremony against the laity and those which regulate the clergy. Laity is just the normal people of the church, the congregation, and the clergy, of course, are those that are the preachers and that have the power in the church. Give me leave to observe that I consider the clerical office as equal in point of dignity with the highest rank in the kingdom, provided that a proper humility of behavior is at the same time maintained." So he's not intimidated by the noble rank of Mr. Darcy. She's tried to say to him, you don't have the right to approach him without an introduction. He's going to be offended by you. He's like, oh, my dear, the church, my level as a clergyman of the church is equal to nobility. You must therefore allow me to follow the dictates of my conscience on this occasion, which leads me to perform what I look on as a point of duty. Pardon me for neglecting to profit by your advice, which on every other subject shall be my constant guide, though in the case before us I consider myself more fitted by education and habitual study to decide on what is right than a young lady like yourself. Definite mansplaining. And with a low bow, he left her to attack Mr. Darcy, whose reception of his advances she eagerly watched, and whose astonishment at being so addressed was very evident. Her cousin prefaced his speech with a solemn bow, and though she could not hear a word of it, she felt as if hearing it all, and saw in the motion of his lips the word apology, Hunsford, and Lady Catherine de Bourgh. It vexed her to see him expose himself to such a man. Mr. Darcy was eyeing him with unrestrained wonder, and when at last Mr. Collins allowed him time to speak, replied with an air of distant civility. Mr. Collins, however, was not discouraged from speaking again, and Mr. Darcy's contempt seemed abundantly increasing with the length of his second speech, and at the end of it he only made him a slight bow and moved another way. Mr. Collins then returned to Elizabeth. "I have no reason, I assure you," said he, "to be satisfied with my reception. Mr. Darcy seemed much pleased with the attention. He answered me with the utmost civility, and even paid me the compliment of saying that he was so well convinced of Lady Catherine's discernment as to be certain she would never bestow a favor unworthily. It was really a very handsome thought. Upon the whole, I am much pleased with him." So he feels like Mr. Darcy received him well. AJ Beck, hi. Um, I'm so glad you made it then, AJ. How did you find me? What book were you reading? I love when people join in and we can chat, but I need to keep reading because I get fussed at from people who are trying to get through Pride and Prejudice. So we'll talk later. As Elizabeth had no longer any interest of her own to pursue, she turned her attention almost entirely on her sister and Mr. Bingley, and the train of agreeable reflections which her observations gave birth to made her perhaps almost as happy as Jane. She saw in her, she saw her in idea settled. She saw her in idea settled in that very house. Oh, like she imagines, in all the felicity which a marriage of true affection could bestow, and she felt capable, under such circumstances, of endeavoring even to like Bingley's two sisters. Mother's thoughts, she plainly, sometimes the wording is awkward. I'm sorry as I struggle. Her mother's thoughts, she plainly saw, were bent the same way, and she determined not to venture near her, lest she might hear too much. When they sat down to supper, therefore, she considered a most unlucky perverseness which placed them within one of each other. And deeply was she vexed to find that her mother was talking to that one person, Lady Lucas, freely, openly, and of nothing else but of her expectation that Jane would be soon married to Mr. Bingley. It was an animating subject, and Mrs. Bennet seemed incapable of fatigue while enumerating the advantages of the match. His being such a charming young man, and so rich, and living but 3 miles from them, were the first points of self-gratulation. And then it was such a comfort to think how fond the two sisters were of Jane, and to be certain that they must desire the connection as much as she could do. It was, moreover, such a promising thing for her younger daughters, as Jane's marrying so greatly must throw them in the way of other rich men. And lastly, it was so pleasant at her time of life to be able to consign her single daughters to the care of their sister, that she might not be obliged to go into company more than she liked. So they're considering all the reasons that there's a likely match of marriage between Bingley and Jane, and all the advantages that would bring the family. Then there were none. Murder on the Orient Express. Well, that's great, AJ. I'm glad that we're, I mean, I love when multiple books help students. I have some students that told me they've read with me from 9th grade all the way through their college year. That just is so like nerdily happy to me. It makes me really glad to hear. In vain did Elizabeth endeavor to check the rapidity of her mother's words, or persuade her to describe her felicity in a less audible whisper, for to her inexpressible vexation she could perceive that the chief of it was overheard by Mr. Darcy, who sat opposite to them. Her mother only scolded her for being nonsensical. "What is Mr. Darcy to me, pray, that I should be afraid of him? I am sure we owe him no such particular civility as to be obliged to say nothing he may not like to hear. For heaven's sake, madam, speak lower. What advantage can it be to you to offend Mr. Darcy? You will never recommend yourself to his friend by doing so. Well, hey, he's friends with Bingley, and we need to stay in good standing with Bingley. So chill it about Mr. Darcy. We know you don't like him. You have a reason not to like him, but, play it cool." Nothing that she could say, however, had any influence. Her mother would talk of her views in the same intelligible tone. Elizabeth blushed and blushed again with shame and vexation. She could not help frequently glancing her eye at Mr. Darcy, though every glance convinced her of what she dreaded, for though he was not always looking at her mother, she was convinced that his attention was invariably fixed by her. The expression of his face changed gradually from indignant contempt to a composed and steady gravity. At length, seriousness. However, Mrs. Bennet had no more to say, and Lady Lucas, who had been long yawning at the repetition of delight which she saw no likelihood of sharing, was left to the comforts of cold ham and chicken. Elizabeth now began to revive, but not long was the interval of tranquillity when the supper was over, singing was talked of, and she had the mortification of seeing Mary, after very little entreaty, preparing to oblige the company. So there's Mary, not beautiful Mary, talented Mary, who's going to now go and entertain everybody. She's just like, can we not have the attention on my family, please? I'm so horrified. Um, by many significant looks and silent entreaties did she endeavor to prevent such a proof of complacence, but in vain. Mary would not understand them. Such an opportunity of exhibiting was delightful to her, and she began her song. Elizabeth's eyes were fixed on her with the most painful sensations, and she watched her progress through the several stanzas with an impatience which was very ill rewarded at their close. For Mary, on her receiving amongst the thanks of the table the hint of a hope that she might be prevailed on to favor them again for a second song, after the pause of a half a minute began another. Mary's powers were by no means fitted for such a display. Her voice was weak and her manner affected, like she puts on like that she's really good when she's not as good as she's carrying on. Elizabeth was in agonies. She looked at Jane to see how she bore it, but Jane was very composedly talking to Bingley. Jane's falling in love. She looked at his two sisters and saw them making signs of derision at one another. They're like, oh my God, this girl, can you believe she's singing? Oh, and she's just horrified. And at Darcy, who continued, however, impenetrably grave. She can't read him. She looked at her father to entreat his interference, lest Mary should be singing all night. He took the hint, and when Mary had finished her second song, said aloud, "That will do extremely well, child. You have delighted us long enough. Let the other young ladies have time to exhibit." Mary, though pretending not to hear, was somewhat disconcerted, and Elizabeth, sorry for her and sorry for her father's speech, was afraid her anxiety had done no good. Others of the party were now applied to. "If I," said Mr. Collins, "were so fortunate as to be able to sing, I should have great pleasure, I am sure, in obliging the company with an air, for I consider music as a very innocent diversion, and perfectly compatible with the profession of clergyman. I do not mean, however, to assert that we can be justified in devoting too much of our time to music, for there are certainly other things to be attended to. The rector of a parish has much to do. In the first place, he must make such an agreement for tithes money giving to the church, as tithes as may be beneficial to himself and not offensive to his patron. He must write his own sermons, and the time that remains will not be too much for his parish duties, and the care and improvement of his dwelling, which he cannot be excused from making as comfortable as possible. And I do not think of it light importance that he should have attentive and conciliatory manners towards everybody, especially towards those to whom he owes his preferment. I cannot acquit him of that duty, nor could I think well of the man who should omit an occasion of testifying his respect towards anybody connected with the family." So we've talked a lot about Collins. What do we begin to know with his behavior? Have you guys ever known a person that really didn't say anything wrong or rude, but was just boring and talked about, I'm trying to think in high school, they talked about all the assignment and the aspects of the assignment. And you guys, maybe you're in a group, a collective group, and a collaborative group, and y'all are working on an assignment together. And you guys want to talk about homecoming, and you want to talk about the football game. You want to talk about the things that your peers are interested in. But there's always that one kid that just really wants to talk about, that would have been me, that really wants to talk about the assignment and, how you're going to execute the assignment. And there's nothing wrong with that kid. That kid just doesn't fit the group very well. And that's kind of Mr. Collins. He's not a bad guy at all. He just doesn't read the room very well. So he's talking about religion and all his responsibilities with religion. And everybody's like, oh, we're supposed to be at a party. And with a bow to Mr. Darcy, he concluded his speech, which had been spoken so loud as to be heard by half the room. Many stared. Many smiled. But no one looked more amused than Mr. Bennet himself, while his wife seriously commended Mr. Collins for having spoken so sensibly, and observed in a half whisper to Lady Lucas that he was a remarkably clever, good kind of young man. To Elizabeth, it appeared that had her family made an agreement to expose themselves as much as they could during the evening, it would have been impossible for them to play their parts with more spirit or finer success. And happy did she think it for Bingley and her sister that some of the exhibition had escaped his notice, and that his feelings were not of a sort to be much distressed by the folly which he must have witnessed. That his two sisters and Mr. Darcy, however, should have such an opportunity of ridiculing her relations was bad enough, and she could not determine whether the silent contempt of the gentlemen or the insolent smiles of the ladies were more intolerable. The rest of the evening brought her little amusement. She was teased by Mr. Collins, who continued most perseveringly by her side, and though he could not prevail with her to dance with him again, put it out of her power to dance with others. So she didn't, hey, Venus, are you working today? She didn't have to dance with him again, but she couldn't get rid of him. And she knows he's interested and she's just not interested. And he's not reading the signs that she's not interested. In vain did she entreat him to stand up with somebody else and offer to introduce him to any young lady in the room. He assured her that as to dancing, he was perfectly indifferent to it, that his chief object was by delicate attentions to recommend himself to her, and that he should therefore make a point of remaining close to her the whole evening. There was no arguing upon such a project. She owed her greatest relief to her friend Miss Lucas, who often joined them and good-naturedly engaged Mr. Collins's conversation to herself. She was at least free from the offense of Mr. Darcy's further notice, though often standing within a very short distance of her, quite disengaged. He never came near enough to speak. She felt it to be probable consequence of her allusions to Mr. Wickham, and rejoiced in it. Siddharth, if you're still there, oh, Venus, I didn't know that. I thought sometimes you had to work on Sunday. Siddharth, if you're still there, there are, what did I tell you, 40 chapters? Like, let's figure out how many more episodes we have to do. Episodes, I don't know what these are. 61, and on average I'm doing about a chapter each, so there's 40 more readings to do of this. Like, it doesn't look like the chapters are that long, but it really takes me a long time to read through it. I'm sorry. The Longbourn party were the last of all the company to depart, and by a maneuver of Mrs. Bennet, had to wait for their carriage a quarter of an hour after everybody else was gone, which gave them time to see how heartily they were wished away by some of the family. Mrs. Hurst and her sister scarcely opened their mouths except to complain of fatigue, and were evidently impatient to have the house to themselves. They repulsed every attempt of Mrs. Bennet at conversation, and by doing so threw a languor over the whole party, which was very little relieved by the long speeches of Mr. Collins, who was complimenting Mr. Bingley and his sisters on the elegance of their entertainment and the hospitality and politeness which had marked their behavior to their guests. Darcy said nothing at all. Mr. Bennet, in equal silence, was enjoying the scene. Mr. Bingley and Jane were standing together a little detached from the rest, and talked only to each other. Elizabeth persevered as steady a silence as either Mrs. Hurst or Miss Bingley, and even Lydia was too much fatigued to utter more than the occasional exclamation of "Lord, how tired I am," accompanied by a violent yawn. "Oh, how tired I am!" When at length they arose to take leave, Mrs. Bennet was most pressingly civil to her hope of seeing the whole family soon at Longbourn, and addressed herself particularly to Mr. Bingley, to assure him how happy he would make them by eating a family dinner with them at any time without the ceremony of a formal invitation. Bingley was all grateful pleasure, and he readily engaged for taking the earliest opportunity of waiting on her after his return from London, whither he was obliged to go the next day for a short time. So he can't come right now because he's got to go to London for a little while. Mrs. Bennet was perfectly satisfied and quitted the house under the delightful persuasion that, allowing for the necessary preparations of settlements, new carriages, and wedding clothes, she would undoubtedly see her daughters settled at Netherfield in the course of 3 or 4 months. So she's sure they're going to marry. Of having another daughter married to Mr. Collins she thought was equally certain, and with considerable, though not equal, pleasure. Elizabeth was the least dear to her of all her children. Ouch! And though the man and the match were quite good enough for her, the worth of each was eclipsed by Mr. Bingley and Netherfield. So it's not that the mother really cares about Elizabeth's happiness. It's just, oh, that's as good as she's going to get, Elizabeth. So that is 30 minutes on the dot. And sadly, that was only chapter 18. So we have chapter 19 to go. Oh, I don't know that we'll ever get this book finished. It looks deceivingly shorter than In the Time of the Butterflies, but the language is hard for me to get through and it's very cumbersome. So it takes me a while. I'm going off to tutor one of my students. If you've followed along, he's one of my students that's in a lot of the books that I read. He always talks. He always has, like, sometimes he coughs or sometimes he sighs or makes great exclamations. And he is now in college, and I'm so excited that he's in college. And I get to tutor him every now and then on papers he's writing. So I get to go this afternoon and work with him. I'm very happy about that. It is a beautiful Sunday here. I hope to get outside in this fresh air. Need my hair to be dry before I do anything. My dad thankfully tested negative to corona, but now my daughter woke up in the night. And they weren't related. It wasn't because they were exposed to each other. My daughter woke up with a terrible throat and head, and she's a massage therapist. So she needs to go and test to make sure she can go back to work. We've got flu starting out. It's just, I know it's pointless to say I just wanted to go away. Like, everybody wants it to go away, but it is defining our generation. Do you think it will define the generation? It's certainly defining the day and the month and the year. So I keep trying to find positive things to fill my life so I'm not stressed with worry. You guys are those positive things. I guess I'm not going to do anything to celebrate 10,000. I need to consider monetizing, because then YouTube does more to support the channel. I just fear monetizing. I feel like I'm kind of an anti-capitalist, and I feel like that's just manipulating you all somehow. It feels a little bit more authentic and organic to just, like, I feel like I would be obligated to do a better quality work if I monetized. And I look at Snow and Kurt on their van lifers. They're more in their 40s, I would guess, if I had to guess. And they're traveling all over Mexico right now. I love van lifers. I just started following a young couple in Sweden, and I've studied in Sweden. So they're on Instagram, and I'll try and link both of those below, because I hope I can start getting van lifers to use my books when they're out, and then they don't have to, subscribe to anything, or they can just have these books with them and have access to books. And I notice a lot of van lifers have shelves of books. I know when my son moved to Brazil, he wanted his books, and audiobooks are not always, I much prefer to hold a book in my hand. And maybe that will be my next poll. Would you rather hold the book in your hand, or would you rather read? And it depends on the situation, I guess. So we'll keep reading Pride and Prejudice for a long time. And then if you haven't ordered Animal Farm, this will be my next. And this is a Penguin edition, a Signet Classics. So if you want to see the cover, it's this. That way, when we're reading along, we're on the same page. And I really do encourage, Irene, I'm so glad you stayed the whole time. I'm glad you're here. I really do encourage you guys to buy the book, because it's good to annotate in it, to keep up with. I think you remember it better, especially if you're doing it for school. Now, if you're just doing it to keep yourself entertained, just listen to the audiobook. But don't forget to subscribe. Venus, have a great Sunday. I hope things are going well for you. Come talk to me over in Discord or on Instagram or wherever you want to talk. I worry about you sometimes. And I will read to you guys next time. See ya.